All right. Hello, everyone out there in social media land. We are the Flint Public Health Youth Academy, and we are excited. We are excited about another talk show, another youth perspective talk show, as we prepare to talk and continue a series on mental health this summer. And so our summer interns here, where our interns are here, and again, are concentrating on this summer topic because it's so important that we talk about mental health. We know this has been a very mentally taxing year with COVID, the number of deaths, the social isolation, so many other taxing, mentally exhausting experiences that people have encountered. And so we want to continue to give our listening audience some nuggets, some resource information, and a platform to really talk about mental health and how they're coping and possibly share strategies that may be beneficial to someone else. So with that, we would like to start our talk show on today. So today is officially June 18th. We know tomorrow is Juneteenth, where we celebrate Juneteenth. We know on yesterday, the President of the United States signed and made it a national holiday. And for those who don't know what Juneteenth is, it is a celebration of the final emancipation of slaves in the United States. Although the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, it was about 2.5 years later in Galveston, Texas, that the last slaves received the information that they were free. So the concept is until we were all free, none of us were free. And so we celebrate this African American Independence Day, and it has been a long haul to get it recognized as a national holiday. So we do celebrate that, and we just want to kind of first stop and honor and recognize that. And the many people who have worked for the past 3, 4, 5, 6 decades to really educate communities around the country on Juneteenth and to preserve this day so that we could have the holiday that we have now. So just a moment of silence and recognition of those that came before us and that who started this work. All right, so we're going to get into this whole concept. So we've been talking about mental health, and we started off talking last week about kind of scratching the surface on mental health. And before we really get into that deep dive, when it comes to individuals, I wanted to kind of change the frame of how we're speaking about mental health. So normally when we have an issue or a violation or a trauma, there's normally a perpetrator, right? And there's normally a victim. And most of the times, the victim is traumatized in some way that impacts them mentally, physically, emotionally. It could be sexually in a lot of ways, right? But what happens when the victim is not an individual, but the victim is a community of people, not an individual person, right? And let's say the perpetrator is not necessarily an individual, but it can be an institution. It can be government. It can be a larger entity outside of one individual. So we want to talk about mental health in the context of community mental health. So I want to ask you guys just to think about this and just kind of weigh in. What are some historical traumas or some historical events that may have created mental trauma for groups of people that you know of or that you are aware of? And it doesn't just have to be in the US, it doesn't just have to be, in Michigan. But what are some historical traumas that you are aware of that could have triggered mental health issues for communities, no matter what the communities are? Kayla.
The Holocaust.
The Holocaust. I saw Christian's hand.
Both major world wars. In fact, any war, realistically, any war.
Yeah. Cruz.
I was actually going to say Japanese internment.
Okay. Anyone else? Cole and then Kayla.
The Dust Bowl.
Yeah. Kayla?
I was just gonna throw in the obvious slavery.
Exactly.
Well, wait,
Christian?
can I say, sorry,
Oh.
can I say
Go ahead.
slavery and all of its resulting institutions and all of its resulting, like, everything from slavery to
All
Jim
the
Crow.
residue that
Yeah,
comes from
yeah,
it.
uh-huh.
Yeah. Christian, then Everett. And then
Trail of
Amir.
Tears.
Go ahead.
Trail of Tears, for sure.
Trail of Tears. Yeah. Everett?
I was gonna say the water crisis in Flint.
The water crisis. Yes. Amir?
Christian took mine, but I was going to say the Great Depression.
The Great Depression. Dr. Bailey, I saw your hand. We can't hear you.
She said apartheid.
Apartheid. Okay. So these are some examples, and there are many others, right? But these are some examples of historical events that have created traumas and mental health issues for communities. And then what are some natural things that happen that can create community level trauma that could also affect the mental health of communities? Think about natural events. Christian, then Cruz.
Any of the major hurricanes, like Hurricane Katrina and such.
Yep, hurricanes. Cruz.
Yeah, he took mine.
Kayla, and then Amir, and then Dr. Bailey.
Tornadoes.
Yes. And we had a big one here in the Michigan area. I think it was in the 60s. Most of us weren't here yet, but it was like out in the Beecher area, and I saw the pictures of it. Go ahead, Amir, then Dr. Bailey. And then Carl.
Tsunami.
Tsunamis.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Dr.
I
Bailey.
was going to say the Beecher tornado here in Flint, but also snow squalls when it's snowing and we're snowed in and we can't get out for days.
Cole, and then Christian.
COVID-19.
Yeah.
Cool, it's like mine.
Christian.
But Khalil did say something which reminded me of COVID-19. He said the bubonic plague, like any large plague, realistically.
Okay. Everett, then Cruz.
Drought.
Yes, a drought,
Earthquakes.
earthquakes. Kayla.
To go along with drought, famine.
Absolutely. So as we can see, and we'll go Dr. Bailey.
Well, I was going to say the forest fires in the West.
Yeah, so the drought, lack of rain out there, and actually they're stating that they're going to start earlier this year because they're seeing extreme dryness a month earlier than what they normally see.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Cool, Cole.
I know it isn't really natural, but toxic runoff.
Yeah. And we see that normally happens in certain communities, depending on what those zip codes are. But again, the idea is that we see traumas on a community level, and it manifests, whether it's through a natural situation, it manifests through man-made situations. And then there's those historical things that people should often say, it's been generations since that happened, get over it. But it's not always that simple to get over, right? And so I wanted to preface this as we move into starting to look at community level trauma and community level mental health, right? Because most of the time when we talk about it, we do talk about it individually. I'm depressed or I'm going through this situation, but what happens when it's an entire community, right? And then how do we galvanize, how do we offer education and interventions and services for communities, and how does that look different than when you're only doing it to individuals? So I kind of wanted to preface that. So how are communities, be they cultural communities or communities situated by geography or by any other similar characteristic, because it could be a community by gender, it could be a community by sexual orientation, right? but how are communities traumatized? And can you speak and give examples of what you've seen? One of the things that you guys didn't say that I had wrote down was the mass shootings. All of these mass shootings that we've been seeing all over the country. It was like, what, this month alone, like 30, right? And so when we think about the impact that that has on our health, how are communities traumatized? And give some examples of what you have experienced. It's from the Flint water crisis perspective or the COVID perspective or any other situation that we may not know. Go ahead, Kayla.
I was going to say another one that we didn't mention that also is sort of an ongoing trauma is just the trauma of the trans community as they continue to see trans people killed on social media, in the news. And then also the trauma of women as we watch, women be assaulted and their stories go unheard, or their assaulters go unpunished. And that's sort of the one that I want to speak on, because I think it has such an impact on the way that we as women perceive ourselves, perceive the value of our voices. And it also has such a great impact on, I would say, sexual assault victims in general, not even just women, because obviously women aren't the only people who experience sexual assault, but it has such an impact on how victims go about their lives and the ways in which they're able to cope with it and whether or not they speak up about it, right? Because that trauma, experiencing the trauma yourself, but then also watching other victims go through that same trauma and not have it resolved or not have it cared for as it should be. It has a large impact, like I said, on the way that these victims view themselves and whether or not they think that it's worth it and what we consider to be sexual assault, right? Because there's also this idea that like, well, my sexual assault isn't sexual assault because he or they didn't do A, B, C, and D. Like it becomes this sort of, not a competition per se, but it makes it hard to recognize the signs of sexual assault because you begin to try to compare and see, well, on Law and Order Special Victims Unit, sexual assault looked like this, but that's not what my story necessarily is. And so I think two things. I think one, like I said, personal perceptions of the assaulter, like sometimes they begin to put blame on themselves. Like maybe, well, I was wearing this, or well, I didn't say no. Well, I said no at first, but I didn't push them, or I wasn't, or maybe they don't feel strong enough anymore. But then I also think it in some ways desensitizes others to the struggle of victims.
Yeah.
Because we don't have, as a society, a concrete understanding of what sexual assault is, because we don't have a concrete understanding of what consent is, but that's a whole nother story. And so I would definitely say that that's definitely a trauma that a community faces, and an ongoing struggle for us as reproductive health advocates to overcome.
So sexual crimes, and then I think you mentioned they categorize a lot of times things, they clump them in buckets, but hate crimes, and that would include whether they're race-based, gender-based, and like you said, we have seen increasing trends the last 3 years of crimes against transgender persons. And I think that when we think about what Kayla is saying, that for many people, whether it's the hate crime or the crime against a woman, a gender-based crime, part of what I'm hearing Kayla say is the way that manifests mentally for some of the victims is they start taking blame for it. And oftentimes that leads into depression, anxiety, and many other internal mental struggles that they have to deal with outside the actualization itself, right? That's with that. Anyone wants to weigh in on that or offer another example of how how communities, whether be they cultural, geographic, or defined by some other similar characteristics, how are they traumatized? Amir, Cruz.
Speaking of like, the hate crime and everything on that topic, the other day I saw, about, how the trend, Stop Asian Hate is going on. I saw a video, a really disturbing video of a dude, he was riding his bike and a dude came up behind him and just stabbed him randomly. Just while he was riding his bike. And it's like, that's traumatizing. If you're Asian American or any Asian, any other culture, that's very traumatizing to see that people really think that and really have that hate in their heart to really be able to do some horrific stuff like that. It's a real shame to me. So.
Yeah, I think a lot of the concept starts from, people who have power or the potential to oppress. They start to look at and cling to things that they're alike. So it might be, oh, we're the same color. Oh, we come from similar cultural backgrounds. And, at first that might be harmless, like how people, be like, oh, pineapple doesn't belong on pizza or things like that. But the issue is when that transforms into something that's way more hateful and negative. And, pineapple on pizza, that's just food. But now when you get into things that, are integral to people's personalities, their character and things like that, now it shapes into something different. And I think how that is placed on victims is that thing is looming over you all the time now. I mean, when it comes to racism and let's say police brutality, as a Black man, I'm always afraid of interacting with police now. Even when I'm not even in contact with a police officer, just hearing about things on the news, it's kind of just weighs on my head and on my brain. And like how we had that one show on intersectionality. Now, if you have levels to your intersectionality, that can like pour through on so many different things. It could be class, like if you don't have a lot of money. It could be if you're a woman or identify in different ways that is not what is categorized as normal. Now you have these things that are stacked and pushed onto you. And a lot of this issue comes from people, deciding that to not, instead of enjoy each other's differences, push against and resist that, and now attack each other for what makes them different, and sort of cling to what makes them similar. But when it comes to the whole reality is we all are similar in some sort of ways. We just have those small differences in what we do with them. And so when it comes to a community level, you have that kind of like mob mentality on those things. And so a lot of the issue there is that it's not necessarily rational, because you have a group of people with you. People tend to believe that that thing makes more sense now, that it's more validated, and that's not necessarily true.
Absolutely. Who was next? Thought it was one other hand. Okay, so as we talk about that, and as we really give narrative to how there are so many, I guess, points of entry to community trauma and how it can manifest in many ways. When we think about responses, right? How do responses look different when you're trying to address the mental health of an individual versus an entire community? So I'll give you an example. When the Flint water crisis happened, there was no one size fit all response. You had people who were traumatized. For people of color, it triggered the historical mistrust by government. For people for European Americans who may not have ever had those historical experiences, it was like, how could you dare do this to us? Like, we're citizens. They were traumatized in a way for the first time in that way by government. Some were. And then when you think about babies, I remember there was a young lady who, I think 5 months after the water crisis was revealed, she and her daughter went to a funeral down south, and her daughter was like 4. And her mom, after the repast at the funeral, her mom took her in the bathroom so they can wash their hands before they go out to get the food. And as she got ready to lift the baby up to put her hands in the water, she said, "No, mama, bad," because she's remembering at home, mom is training me to stay away from the water, right? And so now this baby's relationship with water has this negative connotation, and there's a fear, if you will, that some youth or some children who were born during the water crisis are going to have, and we're going to have to address that over periods of time for them to be able to deal with that. So what is your take on it? We got Cruz, then Kayla.
So I don't think there's ever just a comfortable catch-all, these type of things. There's always like one thing that you can point towards that might help fulfill to a different degree. So normally when it's a large problem, you want to need a large solution, but it also means that there's also going to be numerous simple solutions to follow with it. I mean, in a lot of cases, when it's a systemic problem or institutional problem, policy is one of those things that just needs to be championed. But then there's also all those avenues in between that you need to now take care of, especially when you're talking about with trauma. These are things that mentally impact people, right? So whether that be, you know, having services available for therapy or things like that, there needs to be all these different things that help ease and comfort, because that's a lot of what the issue is here, is that you've displaced or made a group of people discomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Kayla?
Yeah, and I was just going to speak to there in such a situation. I mean, always with a mental health, a trauma related to mental health, there's always a need for empathy, right? And for conversation with the person to say, what did you experience and how did it make you feel? And how can now I best serve you, right? To help heal that trauma, right? And so when it becomes a community trauma, it's sort of the same concept, except there requires a much larger level of empathy and of inclusivity and of outreach to say, and how many different ways did this impact different communities, right? Like you named a few, for example, with the Flint water crisis. Like, you have to acknowledge the traumas of children, but you also have to acknowledge the trauma of young adults and of adolescents and of adults and of people of color and of European Americans and of natives and indigenous people and there are so many different facets, because you may also have to go deeper to say you may have to acknowledge indigenous youth differently than you acknowledge youth of color, even though sometimes those things are overlapping. I understand that, but I'm just saying, and those that don't overlap, you may have to acknowledge those things differently. And so there becomes such a need to speak to the community, but speak personally, and not to speak with one person, or not to just speak with a sample, but to truly speak to the population as a whole. Because there is no, as you said, there is no one size fits all. And also on top of that, as a second layer, because there's no one size fits all, there also needs to be a solution that is ongoing, right? And that's going to acknowledge the fact that, yes, you're going to have to, like the young people in Flint would need therapy, right? They need health intervention, right? They need all of these things, but they're also going to need another added layer of support as they enter into higher levels of education, right? Because this has set them back. So it's nothing that you can just give a solution, set a policy for this year or for this next 5 years. Like, this is when a trauma affects a community, you have to also consider not just the community, but the community as it prospers. And as another added layer, the generation following them who's going to raise the next community. It's really complicated, but when it's that large, like you have to consider every possibility.
And when we talk about generational impacts, right, of community level traumas, we saw that in the water crisis. A lot of young ladies of childbearing age very concerned because the science shared that they would have the lead that they were exposed could be stored in their bone. And when they have children, then the lead will leach out and impact the fetus. And so we're talking about now levels of generational impact. And we're going to get back to that when we talk about slavery and when we talk about Juneteenth and some other things. Dr. Bailey.
Yes, I listened to everything that's been said and wholeheartedly agree. And those insights are really, really, really deep. And I was listening to talking about policy and changing the policies. And that's the first step, because policy change means very little, because we got a lot of policies that are anti-whatever on the books. But until we dig deep enough to begin to change the practice and the procedures so that we can start to deal with behaviors, it's very little that will initially change. And that's something that we have to realize, that so that we don't get frustrated in the work. And I know that's going to lead into your discussion about Juneteenth, about how long it has taken to get Juneteenth recognized as a holiday. And it took people being persistent and doing it anyway. And so sometimes what it's going to tell you, you got to do it anyway. If you know it to be the right thing to do, you will have to do that thing anyway. It's like knowing that I need to read this book because I've got a test, but I want to go outside and celebrate with everybody else. But I have to make myself do that anyway, because there is something that's going to come from it. And in our communities, one of the things that we learned is that when trauma hits the community, it hits all of the community, usually, at different levels and at different points. When the water crisis hit, it hit our young people, but it also hit our older people. It hit people in between. Older people were kind of left out in the original water crisis, and they spoke it, they said it. You left us out. You want to fix this? Come talk to us. We built it. We can tell you how to fix it. In the pandemic, older people were the first ones hit, and younger people were kind of left out. And now we're realizing that this pandemic is going to affect younger people now that you have so many older people already vaccinated and or gone. So we have to be very, very careful that when we are prescribing a community fix, that we don't miss groups, because when we miss people, we leave that opportunity for that thing to fester and to grow. And I have watched it over time and time again, and it makes the work much harder. The other thing about a community prescription is that we can't be silent. It may be painful, but we got to talk about it. We have to say it, and we have to say it often, and we have to say it until you get that feeling, even in the community, because I know as an individual, we will say it until it has no more power over us. But as a community, we have to keep saying it. So people want to know, why do you keep talking about the water crisis? Because we haven't got out the water crisis yet, because it's still going on and I'm still feeling it. So I've got to keep talking about it to try to get beyond it and to get past it.
So Everett, I'm gonna comment on what Everett said, then I'll go to Kayla, then Cole. Everett put in the chat of equity. Everett, you want to speak to who plays in this conversation?
It cut out for me. What was the
question?
You had mentioned equity and the role that equity would play. What role does equity play in this conversation?
Well, it's kind of funny because the definition of equity is basically to give everybody an equal chance. Not only, you know, if somebody is 3 feet tall, you got to give them a 3-foot ladder, while somebody else is 5 feet tall, you got to give them no ladder. Like, that's equity. You can't give somebody who's 6'1" and somebody who's 5'3" the same 6-foot ladder, because they're not going to be on the same level. That's what equity is. So the role equity plays into this conversation is, with generational trauma, you can't give a one-stop solution to everybody, because that's not going to work. People whose water is literally undrinkable, unusable, you can't give them a case of water and be like, hey, take showers, brush your teeth, you know, handle your business. When other people on other sides of Flint have, you know, basically normal water, but it's still undrinkable. Like, you can't give them the same solution and be like, here, it's over with. Like, that's why the Flint water crisis is not over, because everybody hasn't been given the same level of a solution.
Your point is so taken, and you're on point. I just want to clarify your definition. So it's not giving people equal. Equality is giving people equal, the same thing. He's saying you give people what they need.
They need.
3 feet tall, but if Edward is already 6 feet tall, he don't need a ladder at all, right? And so that's what you're getting at, is equity community, what they need. Absolutely. Go ahead, Kayla.
I was just going to say something that Dr. Bailey made me think of was, before even we begin to talk about solutions and remedies to community trauma, we have to first stop traumatizing the community. Like, come on now. because folk will start talking about, okay, well, how do we move forward? How do we move forward? And it's like, you ain't even stopped traumatizing me yet. I'm still traumatized. I'm still being traumatized on an ongoing basis. So at no point is your solution or your intervention going to be effective if, okay, so now you healing people from the trauma and now we're starting to get over it just to be traumatized again. So what the real first step is, stop it. Cut it out. But because we have to acknowledge, and what that takes is because, right, sometimes when we talk about these community traumas, right, we try to solve the side effects, right? Like, it's like you have a cold, right? And maybe you have a runny nose, and you have a runny nose, and you have a cough, and you have this and that, right? And it's like, oh, so I get a medicine for the cough, and I get a medicine for the runny nose, and I get a medicine for this. But really, the reason you keep getting sick is because you're not getting sleep at night. So you're not solving your problem, because you're just gonna get sick again next week because you're not sleeping. You understand what I'm saying? So it's like, you can't give a remedy unless you get to the root. Why are we experiencing these side effects in the first place? Why is this even an issue to begin with? And then once you get to the root, see, that's what we're scared of. That's why they made Juneteenth a national holiday while they're also banning critical race theory in classrooms. Right. Because y'all don't want to get to the root. Y'all talking about the side effects. Let's really talk about it, even though I'm thankful that Juneteenth is a national holiday. But I've been celebrating Juneteenth. That's not my concern. My concern is police brutality. You still won't defund the police. But anywho,
we gonna get to it. Just so you know, some of us who've been activists and are still activists have been saying thank you. And I said this earlier, and thank you for making this a national holiday, but let's not get it twisted that this does not substitute for the agenda that we're putting forth around equality and dealing with these inequities and dealing with police brutality and these other disparities. So that's not a compromise. That's a thank you, but now let's get back to the regular scheduled program.
That's
all
like
right.
A Band-Aid on a broken leg. It is not fixed. Thank you, but it is not fixed. Anywho, go ahead.
Right. Bruce, go ahead.
So
See your
basically
hand.
what I want to say is that in a summary, what matters a lot here is intent and of concern. Like, do you actually care to really solve the problem, or are you just doing this because you know there's a problem there? And within that, that's acknowledging the whole problem that's there. So it's not
Yeah.
just like Kayla was saying, oh, you sick, so let me slide you these medicines. No, it's like, okay, so I know there's a problem here, and so I'm going to really sit down and figure out a key solution to it. And now that I found a solution, I'm gonna keep running tabs on it. Maybe establish a task force to make sure it gets accomplished. Maybe run through all these avenues to make sure that there's a whole solution there. One of the things that I want to mention is kind of what Dr. Bailey brought up as well, is that you can't really ignore groups of people either, because then they feel silence. They feel like they don't have any control there, and that's going to add some more trauma, because now it's like they can't trust you either. And so there's a lot of issue there where it comes to like, how do we go about really solving these things? But a lot of it comes down to, are you really sitting down with the genuine concern that you need to actually solve it? And if you don't have that, someone else needs to be there. That job
And we
has to
did
be for
see
someone
that.
who wants that.
And we did with the Hispanic community and our deaf community and the disabled community when people were first, galvanizing around the water crisis. We had to make special provisions to make sure that people did not forget. And when you're holding any type of town hall or information session, you need to make provisions for that, because again, that's part of our whole community, right? All right, so the other thing that one of you guys mentioned was, I think it was Dr. Bailey, and then Kayla touched on it, but no real time community, right?
We have no idea what you're saying, Dr. Key.
You can't hear me?
Now we can.
When the water crisis first happened, do you remember what they were saying about the activists when they were first protesting in the beginning? Who remembers what they were saying? The government is the day. Go ahead, Cole.
They said that the protesters were a bunch of like lazy, I mean, not lazy, but bored housewives. That's what they were saying.
Yep, bored housewives, that we were crazy. We were making this up, hysterical. That's part of that traumatizing, re-traumatizing the people that's already being traumatized, right? Because we're trying to vocalize what the pain is, and in doing that, you're delegitimizing the voice of community, right? And so we have to be careful not to do that. So here's my next question. When we talk about mental health, and we know that there still is stigma about mental health in the many sub-communities that make up our whole community, how do we address the stigma around mental health on a community level? Kayla, then Cruz, and then is that your hand, Christian? Then Christian.
Yeah, I would just say through conversation, through transparent conversation, right? I think in order to destigmatize something, we first just have to talk about it, right? Like we have to stop sweeping things under the rug and pretending that we aren't experiencing what we're experiencing, or that what we're experiencing isn't real. Sometimes, especially with this idea of racism, not this idea, but the experience of racism by people of color, sometimes we will pretend, oh, that don't affect me, or I'm used to it. Or we will pretend that the side effects that we're experiencing aren't caused by the root issue of racism, right? Like us delegitimizing our feelings around racism has also led to toxic masculinity and for Black people and Black men, because we for so long have tried to say, have tried to suppress our feelings instead of just speaking about it, right? Have tried to say, oh, because I'm strong, I don't feel. But because I'm resilient, I'm not experiencing sadness or this doesn't affect me, when the fact of the matter is it does affect you. You're just suppressing it. And that spews out in other ways. So I think the first step is really for us to be transparent and honest with each other about what we're experiencing, because we can't relate to one another within a community until I hear, oh, you felt that? Oh, you saw that? I saw that too. I felt that too. I experienced the same thing. Well, now because you told your story, I feel comfortable telling my story because you affirmed that what I'm experiencing is valid and that it's true and that it's real and that it exists. And unfortunately, we as people, until we feel that sense of community, that sense of uprising and uplifting, and that's why during the pandemic, people were so bold in speaking out, because we have nothing better to do than listen to one another talk via social media, via the news, via whatever that was, via Zoom, whatever that was. People were finally telling their stories. And that's what has power. Like statistics, yes, that's powerful, sure. The news, yes, that's powerful, sure. Government reports, yes, that's powerful, sure. But stories, personal stories, I can relate to that. I see myself in you. You can see yourself in me. That's what allows us to really be like, wait, this isn't scary. We don't have to be afraid of our trauma. We can overcome it together. But in order for us to do that, we first need to acknowledge the fact that it does exist.
Absolutely. Cruz, then Christian.
I agree wholeheartedly with Kayla. And the reason why it's prolonged so long and these things can't continue to come up is because it's not simple or easy to solve. A lot of this is impacted by our different cultural norms and things like that, or different societal things that dictate, oh, this is how things are going to operate. And so what we have to do is also alter that. And a lot of that can be done through conversation, but a lot of it just has to do with, when it comes to your interpersonal relationships, like, hey, this is how I'm going to operate. I believe this certain thing, and try to, get other people to also believe that too. Persuasion in a non-aggressive, like agitating way, but that type of thing helps, because a lot of the way, for example, the Black community, a lot of our trauma has feel like it's been stuffed down, silenced, and acted if it's not real. And so it's really hard to now go to therapists who might do something similar. Not only do you have to step out of your comfort zone, but now you have to put yourself in a position where, now that you've had this trust and this faith, it can now be, pushed further and, increased. And so a lot of that has to do with, like we were saying earlier, having these conversations and really trusting, believing, and, not silencing voices. But stepping past that, a little bit of what can be done is, going and, speaking to these people who might understand you. A lot of what I've heard is that it's from simple as, a Black person goes to a Black therapist, that makes the difference for them. And now that's not always possible. It depends on your resources and what opportunities you have. But, be open-minded and things like that. Shift the norm, potentially put yourself in that position. And now if it works out, let people know. And recommend that person. Obviously, that person's great. So I think it's doing things where you're understanding that you got to step outside of your comfort zone sometimes. If you really want to impact change and evoke positivity or growth, that's kind of what we have to do. And we should make that be a thing that's more natural, or at least something that is championed or spoken about like it's a positive thing. Because there's a lot of times where we also push this narrative of like, oh, that person's doing something different, so they're wrong. That's not what we should do.
Great, Christian.
I wholeheartedly agree with Kayla and Cruz. And there's really, again, like Cruz said, there really is no easy way to go about this, because everybody takes everything different. It just depends. It truly depends. There's communities that take things different than other communities, but in reality, we are all human. We can all learn to do it. We can all, bond together through these things, these experiences, which does come down to single person mental health. Like you go down and, talk to this one person, which again, if they'll have a better day, they'll feel more comfortable. They might, make someone else go, or it'll just grow. It's a butterfly effect. So again, it's going to take a lot of time because after all the things that's been going on the past several years, several hundred, several thousand, however long you want to talk about it, it's just gotten so difficult because we've gone so deep into the rut, and we're going to have to pull it all back out to be, you know, as functional of a society as we can possibly be. So there's going to be a lot of work that we need to do. But as long as we stick to it, as long as we actually make maneuvers, and we can do that all today. We can do anything we want. I mean, it's especially because things are getting way easier with technology and, you know, accessible media, and the ability of having your voice and such projected to a bigger screen and media source. But again, it all comes down to dedication and comfortability, because comfortability will make people relatable with others, which will increase comfortability for more people. And maybe one day we can have it to where everyone can just talk about whatever issue, because we're always going to have different issues than other people. It's just how it is. No person's the same. So there's going to be issues that are brought up, and instead of striking it down as in like, oh, you're different, well, what's wrong with you? You know, say, oh, you're different, let's talk about this and fully understand it so we know what to do if it is a bad thing. If it's a good thing, then good. Project it as a good thing, you know, maybe other people want to do something different too. So again, it's going to take a very long time, or it could even take very little time. It just depends on how society can take it. But specifically, it's just about the dedication and the comfortability with other people. So
Yeah, I was listening to what you guys were saying, and it sounds to me like, and if I get that wrong, just correct me. But one of the prescriptions is coming together. It's points of coming together, and not only coming together for the negative, but coming together and celebrating the positive. Because I know one thing that lifts my spirits when I'm down is celebrating. You know, just even if it's just a small thing, you know, but for community-wide celebration. I remember as a kid, and this is a long time ago, you guys, we used to have this thing called block parties. And we would go like a whole week. And life was not easy, but we would determine one day on the weekend, we'd have a block party. And the whole block would come together, bring food, celebrate, be together, and then we go back to our lives. And it made everything almost bearable. And sometimes the best that we can get out of it is to be able to bear it for a little while and to the next time. So maybe that's something that we can also use as a prescriptive for community dialogue.
I was just going to say really quickly, and what all of this requires is just for us to show up for one another within our communities, to show up even if my hurt doesn't look like your hurt, or my trauma doesn't show up in the ways that your trauma show up, to say that yes, your trauma is still valid, and I still agree that yes, you experienced that, and it's okay that you're feeling something different than what I'm feeling, or that you're feeling big feelings, or that you show up in whatever authentic way, in whatever way is authentic to you, right? But once again, in order for us to have these conversations and for people to feel comfortable in these spaces, we have to stand up for one another, and to be there, and to be present, to sometimes hold the hand or be the shoulder or be the strength when they don't have it, and just be present, to be present at all times.
So some of these responses are going into what my next question is. So you guys are kind of answering some, but I wanted you as survivors in the Flint water crisis. That's how I frame it. We're not survivors because it's not over, but survivors in the ongoing Flint water crisis. As we talk about generational trauma, what would you tell your children? Fast forward this. You have children and grandchildren. What would you tell them the greatest lesson that you have garnered to protect your mental health? And you can talk about it from the angle of the water crisis. You can talk about it angle of the racial protest. You can talk about it from the angle of also, let me see, how do I want to say it? You can talk about it also from the racial protests, but also from the shootings that we're seeing, the mass shootings, because some of us have family that were actually victims of some mass shootings. So what say you? What would you tell your children or your children's children? Cruz? Then Christian.
So the first thing I would tell them is to speak up and connect and get voices that aren't necessarily like yours, because that's the way that you're going to have the most impact. You're stronger together, all those things. The reason I would give such general and non-specific advice is because each problem is different and things like that. But also, I mean, I don't have all the answers at this point. But that I know that is something that I've personally found is what helps the most. And whether it's not actually evoking change politically or through institutions, it is strengthening your community in some sort of way. Having those voices being said and heard by other people who have maybe similar ideas or, can also help broaden that voice, that matters. And it's going to have an impact. I can't vouch for what type of impact that's going to have, but I can vouch that it's going to do something. And that's all we really can do, is continue to try to fight whatever battles we're going through, surpass whatever traumas we encounter, and continue to, push past all of that. And so you just got to fight at the end of the day. That's kind of what you got to do. And so find that way that works the best for you. Maybe that's not necessarily going to a protest, but that could be, being a resource for others. And so whatever you find that fits towards that puzzle, be that piece.
And I'm right there with Cruz. I mean, you took the words out of my mouth. One of the biggest things I tell the kids and grandkids is just don't fear speaking up. Like Cruz said, that could be about anything. So let's say in a hypothetical situation, the Flint water crisis is over, COVID's gone, and all the mass shootings, whatever, the biggest issues are just gone, right? That doesn't mean life's going to be fair. Things are still going to be going wrong. And just because things happened when I was a kid or when I'm growing up and stuff like that, doesn't mean it won't happen again further down the road, maybe when I'm not there. So I want the kids to know, what specifically to do, and possibly just, the main issue, again, it's very, you can't tell. It's several years into the future. You don't know. So you have to make it very general, but generally just having the courage, I'd say, is the best word you could say, the most dedication and such to speaking out when there's an issue and when life isn't fair, because no matter what, life's not going to be fair. There's going to be things that go wrong, and that doesn't mean you have to sit there and let it happen. You can fix things, you can work toward things, you can fight for things. That's what we're doing in Flint, and all across the world. There's so many different issues you have to fight for, because otherwise it wouldn't change. You'd stick in it. So I just love to see, if I was spiritually up there and like several hundred years later, for the generations beyond, if they're still fighting for issues and not just cowering to the masses and just saying, nope, I can't do it. It's not fair. I don't want to do anything anymore, because we're all in it together. We can all work to make the world a better place. And that's what we do on a consistent basis, whether it's vocalized or not. So I just don't want them to feel as if their voice does not matter. And I want them to realize that they do have power, even if they're just one person on 7 or 8 billion people on the planet. Every voice matters. And the best thing you can do is use it,
Cool. Thank you. Cole, then Kayla.
I would like to touch upon the whole power thing. So like this kind of ties in with multiple questions with like trauma and stuff like that, is that a main cause for trauma is just feeling powerless, feeling optionless, feeling like you could have done something, yet you just had you had no option that you could have done. Yet you're in the future and you're thinking, man, I really could have done this and I really couldn't have done that. But the truth is, like, you can do something. Like, no matter what, you have power. You are not powerless in this world. Even when you're rock bottom, there's still a way up.
That's
Thank
beautiful.
you, Cole.
I was just gonna say, and this is, I wouldn't say opposite, but you know, I think this is the other side of speak up, speak out. I, for me, would emphasize with my children and my grandchildren to protect their peace by sometimes being okay with not being the voice. Like sometimes you need to take a break and that's okay. Sometimes you're tired and that's okay. This is exhausting and that's okay. Even if you're like, I sometimes have had my people from the older generation be like, girl, you're 19, you're just starting. It's not that hard. It's not that bad. I've been doing this for years and years and years and years. Like, if you think that's bad, wait till you get, no. It is hard doing this, waking up, literally just waking up as a Black woman, understanding the history of trauma for Black women in this country itself is not a burden. I'm not going to call it a burden because I love being a Black woman, but that's something to confront, right? And so for me, I would just emphasize the fact that it is okay to not always be the loud voice in the room. It is okay to need a second. It is okay to take a week. It's okay to take a day. It's not about the break. It's about just coming back. But take your time and breathe and maybe just go get a smoothie instead of going to the protest, and still send them good vibes and your prayers and all of that. But sometimes you just can't take it. And one of my struggles has been just realizing that I can't be everywhere at once and I can't fight every battle at once, and every battle is not my battle to fight, right? And so even though I love all of these different communities, it is possible to stretch yourself thin. And when you've stretched yourself too thin, you're not that effective anyway. So I would just say for them, I would tell them to be intentional about where they put their energy, and to be intentional about sometimes just pulling back and putting energy into themselves.
Great. I see Cruz hand.
Yeah, and I also just want to add the additional nugget of uplift voices that aren't from your similar struggle. That's also really important. You are not a monolith. You don't understand everyone's trauma. But when there are voices that aren't like yours, you should also respect those. And then if you have power or a platform to uplift them, you should. It's just that simple. It's be an ally, all those good things.
Absolutely. Anyone want to weigh in before we get ready to close out, Everett?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak on the be that peace thing that Cruz is kind of pushing. We talked about it in a puzzle type format, but I wanted to also talk about it in a chess type format. In chess, there's a bunch of different pieces, and each piece does a certain thing, you know. And like Kayla was saying, if you spread yourself too thin, trying to be every piece on the chessboard, you're not gonna be effective. Every piece on the chessboard can't do the same job. That's why there's different pieces, and people are the same exact way. I can't do what Kayla does. I can't do what Cruz does because I'm not Kayla. I'm not Cruz. So my advice to my grandkids would be yourself, play your part in it like it's a chessboard. Do what you can do. And then whatever you can't do, all the people on your team, all the people on your chessboard, those people will handle their part.
Wonderfully stated. Right. Anyone else? Chris?
Sorry, I just want to add on with Everett because that chess analogy is amazing. Another big factor in it that Kayla also touched on is pacing yourself. I mean, imagine if you played chess and you moved every single piece at once, just the whole board, everything moving. It would be chaos. So You know, in chess, you take turns, you move one piece at a time. You can do the same thing. You know, you can do one thing at a time. You don't have to do everything at once to make sure the world's going to be perfect just on your own accord, you know? Pacing yourself and keeping yourself healthy is one of the most, and organized mainly, is the most healthy thing you can do consistently. And you can do that very well. I mean, an open mind is going to make you only play the game better if you don't push all of your pieces up at once. So
Yeah, and I was going to just expand Everett's analogy, metaphor, to say, because us Christian folk love to talk about parts of a body. And so we as if you think about it, as parts of a body, like the hand doesn't function in the same way that the foot does, but the foot is never jealous because it's not a hand, because you need both. And in the same way, like your leg doesn't work the same way that your arm does, but you need both. They function in different capacities, but they're still necessary parts of the whole. So I think, Everett, it's just a great lesson, and a way to stay in your lane. Like, find your lane and stay in it. There's no need to veer off into other directions, because you just cause accidents that way.
Hello. And goodbye. Wonderful. Any other final comments before we close out? I think this has been a wonderful conversation as we're kind of dissecting the concept of community level traumas and community mental health. Anyone else before I get ready to close us out? We're coming up on an hour now. Well, I would like to say thank you all out in radio, social media, TV land, whatever land you're connecting with us on. We're so excited to have had this conversation as we talk about community level traumas. If nothing else, takeaway messages are: first, acknowledge what it is and give voice to what it is. And then find other folk who have a different expression, but who knows what it is well. And then I think another takeaway is that there's no one way to fix it for everyone, but share what works for you. What I share may not work for Cruz, but it may work for Amir. It may work for Everett and not Khalil. Comes up with may work for Khalil and work for Cruz, right? And so I think that we're together, we're stronger when we're together. And like Everett said, if all of us play our parts on this chess game, we should be able to win the game. So thank you again. Join us Friday after next, same time on our Facebook channel as we continue our campaign on mental health. Thank you so much for joining and have a good evening.